So recently on this channel, we've had some moderate success theorizing about what would happen if we crossed over a popular Eastern character with a Western one. And while we're working diligently on the continuation of that saga, we want to give some content in between. So here's a fun one-off using a similar premise.
So what would it be like if Kenshin Himura, Tosai the Manslayer, met Don Diego de la Vega, Zorro?
This might seem like an odd pairing, but just hear me out here. Zorro is a character with a long history and has had great influence in the 100 years since he's been created. And while some characters he's inspired is obvious, I'd argue that he created a trope that Kenshin definitely falls into. The incredibly talented fighter with a noble soul who hides it all under a foolhardy, even buffoonish exterior. Sound familiar? There's only one major problem with these characters meeting: time. While both Zorro's stories and Kenshin's are set in the 19th century, albeit separate countries halfway across the globe from each other, the biggest wrinkle would be in the time period in which they take place. Kenshin's adventures at the start of his series take place in Japan's Meiji era, which started in 1868. Zorro's swashbuckling adventures, however, occur much earlier in the century. The starting point is vague at best, but the character usually hangs up the cape concurrent with the end of the Mexican War of Independence in 1821. After all, it's hard for Zorro to fight tyranny when the tyrant has been kicked out of the country. However, a story exists in Zorro's canon that provides a wonderful fix for this problem. In the series Django Zorro, an aged Don Diego de la Vega meets a former slave turned bounty hunter in the unclaimed American West. In this adventure, Diego still longs for the days of his youth, fighting injustice wherever he sees it, and inspiring people to revolt against those that would oppress them. Now, given that the events of the Django Unchained film occur in 1858, and that the events of this comic are set sometime after that, nowhere near as large a stretch for Diego to still be alive in 1868. So, with all that justified, let's start the story. It is 1868, and a brutal civil war has just ended in Japan. After significant bloodshed, Japan is now open to the rest of the world. The global community is excited for the opportunity this presents from both a cultural and financial point of view. But an old Spanish Don is excited for another reason. Having spent his youth in service of the people, Diego de la Vega never got the opportunity to see the world as he had once wished. He'd had his fair share of adventures, but never got to experience the grandeur of what waited out in the world. And so, while the circumstances surrounding Japan's now open nature were bloody, he chose to view this as an opportunity to see some place that few Westerners ever would. Meanwhile, in the Japanese countryside there existed a tortured soul, a man who had killed hundreds in the war, and with them he'd lost his own humanity. Driven to be some kind of monster, the events of the conflict had eaten away at him, the trauma too great. This was now an age of peace, and he had no place in it. Kenshin had become a wanderer, going from village to village, searching for meaning or purpose. But also, for forgiveness. The only thing he'd been sure of was his wish to atone for the horrors he'd taken part in. And so he sought out the families of those he'd killed, wishing to find some way to help them. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't seem to bring him the peace he hopes for. Diego, however, was happy to be traveling even at such an old age, was doing his bones some good. While the large cities of Tokyo and Kyoto held some interest for him, he'd longed to see the country itself. He began to take trips into small villages and towns, always causing a great deal of excitement anywhere he would visit. A foreigner this far inland would never have been seen even 10 years earlier. Yet, here was this man in such strange, colorful clothing. He was particularly kind to the children, constantly giving away treats and even small pieces of metal the kids were too young and poor to realize was raw gold. Diego had even picked up a bit of sleight of hand from his departed friend Bernardo, something the children of the villages were particularly amused by. But all this attention eventually attracted the wrong kind of notice. Local thieves and bandits soon took stock of Diego, and given his age, thought of him as an easy mark. But they would not strike in broad daylight in the middle of a town. Instead, these bandits decided to follow Diego's carriage as he left. A foolish move, they thought, traveling away in the night. Little did they know the man they were dealing with. Diego de la Vega was no fool. He could tell when the wrong kind of people had their eyes on him. And even at such an age, his skills had not quite left him yet. He chose to leave at night to bait these would-be thieves. Zorro as a legend hadn't gotten far out of Latin America. These bandits were truly to attack him in the cover of darkness. Diego would ensure that the etching of his Z would become a legend in Japan too. As luck would have it, Diego wasn't the only one to notice ill intent upon his person. Kenshin had just so happened to be in the same village Diego was leaving that night. He'd admired the old foreigner's kindness and generosity, and though he'd sworn off violence, Kenshin knew of other ways to ensure the safety of an old man. He needed to. He could scare off these bandits for him. So while Diego's carriage rode, it was followed by a trail of thieves and wandering samurai. Diego instructed the carriage to pull over in a clearing along the wooded path of the road. His driver didn't feel it was a good choice, but figured it best not to argue with the man. The bandits didn't think much of it as they approached. They surrounded the carriage, and Kenshin, only a bit further away, prepared to put his plan into action. But just as he was about to, a strange voice speaking in rather flat Japanese with an unfamiliar accent rang throughout the woods, telling the thieves to leave lest they feel the sting of his whip and the slash of Zorro's blade. The bandits laughed, figuring it must be the old fool in the carriage trying to scare them or some hopelessly outnumbered bodyguard. Diego smirked to himself under the mask. The calling of Zorro was never over. No matter his age, he would fight those who prey upon others. And so, as the thieves moved in on the carriage, a loud crack of a whip came and sparked some rocks on the ground, which then lit a fire in the shape of a Z within the clearing. Some of the superstitious gang ran off at that alone, but they were all frightened. The sudden fire made the sparse light within the woods pitch black by comparison. The remaining bandits were both scared and night-blind. Kenshin in the distance was perplexed. He'd seen his fair share of tricks in the war, but the staging of this was so intricate, the knowledge of how the targets would react so complete. He could tell this was done by someone with a great deal of experience. He watched as one of the shadows in the forest suddenly moved in on the remaining bandits. A brief glimmer of steel as a strange sword Kenshin had never seen was drawn. He was tempted to look away, for any bloodshed had grown to disgust him. Zorro moved in on the thieves. The first one he attacked from behind. 3 quick slashes were followed by a scream as the thief clawed at his back. He turned, and his comrades saw a large bloody Z carved into him. The man quickly fell to the ground. Not dead, just in shock and pain from the cut. The remaining 4 thieves drew their weapons, ready to fight, but they had no idea where the one who made the cut had vanished to. Suddenly, a long whip extended from the darkness and yanked the sword out of one of the thief's hands. Unarmed, the thief bolted into the darkness away from this fight. The 3 bandits left quickly put their backs together, swords raised. Another crack of the whip came like a snake from the darkness. It too seized one of the swords, but though it was able to disarm the man, as intended, one of his comrades quickly slashed at the whip, cutting it. A black figure emerged from the darkness surrounding them. Zorro smiled. He congratulated the thief for this quick blade, but like the fox for which he was named, he moved with devilish speed and slashed the face of the other remaining swordsman, who also ran off. Now it was just Zorro and 2 thieves, one unarmed and clearly frightened, the other surprisingly calm and holding his sword at a crossguard. Zorro took a pose, completely unfamiliar to the thief, his body sideways, with his strange sword extended out toward his opponent. Suddenly Zorro lunged at the man, his blade shooting right past the katana in his opponent's hand and missing his shoulder by mere inches. Quickly, the thief moved back to try and gain some distance, but Zorro kept advancing, continually stabbing with his rapier, taunting his opponent. The bandit tried to swing his own blade to block, but by the time he could reposition for a counterstrike, Zorro's blade was quickly slashing back and stabbing again. Kenshin had moved closer to the scene and was honestly as perplexed as the thieves fighting this masked warrior. The sword style was unlike anything Kenshin had seen in the war. Even the style of the blade was completely bizarre. No curve, straight like a needle. Meant to be thrust like a spear, but still with an edge all the way to the hilt, allowing for slashes when needed. The fighter, so far away from his opponent that any attempt to close the gap would mean absolute vulnerability to attack. The masked man seemed to have every advantage, until... The crack of Zorro's whip was heard again, but this time it did not come from Zorro. The remaining bandit that had been left unarmed, but had not fled as Zorro had hoped he would. He instead waited and picked up the remnant of Zorro's own whip, bided his time, and caught Zorro by the ankle, yanking and tripping him. Zorro lost control of his blade as he fell to the ground. The thief he'd been battling, smacking it away into the woods at the first opportunity. Diego cursed himself as he lay in the dirt, a mistake he never would have made in the past. It seemed he'd lost his touch in these years of peace. The two thieves began to kick him on the ground, quickly doing damage to his old body. In the darkness, Kenshin felt himself compelled to step in. But he'd sworn off violence. The war was over. He would not lift a sword to kill again. Though he could not help but look on as this strange man was being mercilessly beat before his eyes. And though he wanted to act, he didn't even have a sword to fight with. Until he looked down at his feet. There, as if destined for him, sat the strange blade of the masked man. Kenshin reached for it, but hesitated, his arm going so naturally for the handle. It was almost all he knew. How to be a killer. How to use a blade as an instrument of war, of death. Though it shamed him, Kenshin could not bring himself to go back into that life, even if it meant the death of this man. But that was when Kenshin realized. The man before him, the one that needed his help, hadn't killed anyone that night. He mostly just scared them off. The few that remained he hurt, there was little doubt of that. But a scar would heal, and perhaps serve as a reminder of what a life of poor decisions would get them. The bandits grew tired of pummeling the man who had so shortly ago been toying with them. The one still holding his sword raised it up high and prepared to bring it down and slice into the battered fighter on the ground. But just as the blade was about to connect, Kenshin appeared faster than anyone could realize. He blocked the bandit's katana using Zorro's rapier. Shrugging off the blade of the thief, Kenshin rose and stood with the rapier over Zorro's barely conscious body. Kenshin positioned himself between Zorro and the thieves. He held the rapier, strange as it was, and remembered the way Zorro stood with it, keeping the blade extended far from himself and forcing his opponents to keep their distance. Kenshin spoke few words to the bandits, warning them to leave while they still had opportunity. They did not, and so he advanced. His years of fighting had meant his body was ready for this battle, but having to adjust to the new style of the rapier meant his training and techniques were unusable. Luckily, his opponents were much less skilled than himself. Kenshin was able to quickly adapt to the fencing style and make quick, piercing blows on the thief still holding his sword. While not able to utilize his techniques to their fullest, his knowledge of the weaknesses in any adversary allowed him to hit points that were far from fatal, but would put the thief completely out of the fight. All that was left was Kenshin and the thief with half a lip. Kenshin moved back to his pose with the rapier. Staring down the last thief, he told the man again to leave, that the battle was over. With fear in his eyes, the thief dropped the whip and ran off into the darkness. Kenshin quickly attended to Zorro. Removing his mask to check for wounds, Kenshin's suspicions were confirmed that this masked warrior was the same old man he'd seen in the village. Kenshin moved Diego into the carriage and told the driver to move on slowly to the next town. As they rode through the night, Kenshin looked after Diego. He was hurt from the beating, and while Diego had claimed he'd had far worse injuries in his lifetime, the years between those days and now had added up. He would not be able to walk off these wounds the next day. They rode through the night and came to a small village late the next morning. Using Diego's money, Kenshin was able to set up room and board for them at a small farmhouse. The two would stay there over the next few weeks as Diego recovered. During that time, the two had many conversations. Diego telling Kenshin of his adventures and how he had helped inspire a people to revolution back in his homeland. Kenshin told Diego of the war that haunted him, how he had become a proficient killer, and that he could not get past the lives he'd taken. Diego had killed in his day, but never on the same scale as Kenshin, only in the heat of his most intense battles, and even so, reluctantly. He saw such skill in Kenshin, and when the young man talked about being directionless, about never wanting to touch a sword again, he could not have it. Diego was an older man, from a culture that romanticized the sword, as long as it was used for a noble purpose. That wide-eyed sense of adventure had never left him, even in his old age. Kenshin, however, was a young man with a strong distaste for any violence, even when the cause was good. He thought the cause of the war was just, but then when the battle started, it was just war. However, Diego kept pushing. He could not allow such a strong fighter with such a good soul to swear off their calling. Zorro had been born out of a sense of duty. Duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. And from the day he put on the mask and raised his blade against tyranny, Diego de la Vega knew he would never give it up. That while any person lived in fear of cruelty, he would stand as a symbol of hope. He told this to Kenshin, who admired so much about this strange man from half a world away. But he knew that this path was not quite for him. Though to try and at least meet Diego in the middle, Kenshin agreed that he would never refuse to pick up a sword again, just that he would never kill. Diego had to accept this as good enough. Seeing Kenshin fight, talking with the young man about his experiences, Diego began to be envious of his youth. For while Diego had truly meant that he would always stand as a symbol of hope, he could not do so forever. His age was finally catching him, and taking on a few bandits had almost been too much for him, something he lamented to Kenshin. However, Kenshin had a suggestion in return. Diego had enjoyed his time abroad as much as he was going to. Before too much longer, he'd feel the need to don the mask and cape, yet again. Kenshin told him that that could be such a waste. For Zorro to fall in some petty battle with some bandits, not the death he deserved. Instead, Kenshin suggested something that, for whatever reason, had not crossed Diego's mind. While Diego could not always stand as a symbol of hope, there was no reason Zorro couldn't. Diego had grown old, a rare occurrence for someone who lives by the sword. It was time to pass his knowledge on, for him to teach others how to fight for a just world, how to inspire, how to be Zorro. And that's it! A simple story about two heroes of East and West inspiring one another. Something that obviously never happened, but given the characters, works really well. I hope you enjoyed this brief one-off and look forward to more down the line. And hey, if you've never checked out Zorro before, but this interested you in the character, I highly suggest Matt Wagner's run in the comics that started with Zorro Year 1 and ended with Django Zorro. I'll be sure to post a link to that in the description. Also, you may have noticed, I'm not British. Sid Part 2 here, been helping write the Dragon Ball DC videos and decided to take a crack at one myself. Thanks to Geek for Fun for letting me go about it alone. If you enjoyed, then head on over to my channel and check out what I get up to over there.